States federal government should abolish the Federal Reserve, we affirm. Okay, so we're just going to get right into this. We're going to go directly to the plan. The plan is that the United States Congress should abolish the Federal Reserve starting by fiscal year 2012 to 2013. The act is Congress. The Congress is actually what created it in 1913, so it has the power to destroy it as well. I think that's not going to be challenged in the round today. The funding is non-existent. Basically, we don't need funding to end this because we already allocate certain amounts of funding there anyway, so it's not going to provide any cost to the United States. The value I want you to use to weigh this round today is going to be net benefits, just to see what is in the best interest of the United States, because an actor acts in its own best interest. So what's really, that means that what's really important right now is what's going to occur after our plan, which brings us to our two advantages that are laid out in uniqueness, link, and impact form, so that we don't need to go through the inherency, solvency, stock issue type thing. Okay, so our first advantage, it creates the United States is going to be more self-accountable for its spending and like actual, and it's going to reduce deficit spending and things like that. So the uniqueness is our subpoint A, that both the United States and the United States federal government and the Federal Reserve right now have the power to loosen or tighten money, and that basically the Federal Reserve uses the discount rate and it uses banks to basically increase the amount of increase the supply of money that's out there to loosen money. Whereas the United States federal government actually has the mints and is capable of printing money or not printing as much money, because what the actual mints do is they take in a lot of money every single year and just dispose of it. And so the way that they can tighten money is by taking that money, not printing more money to replace it. Yeah.
All right, so you said it's going to start in either 2012 or 2013. Which one is it?
It's fiscal year 2012, 2013, which you should be familiar with. It starts in, yeah, it has 2 years, just because that's how fiscal years work. Okay, so now that we've established the uniqueness there, we can go on to the B, which is the links to that get us to the impacts. So the first link is that the plan stops the Federal Reserve from loosening because basically there is no Federal Reserve anymore. They're not going to have the powers to loosen money or anything like that. The second internal link is that only the United States federal government will now be printing money to loosen or tighten. And this means that it's going to be more direct, and this means that there's going to be, in some ways, more backlash because the voters are going to be knowing who is doing what, and they're not going to have to split it between, well, is it the Federal Reserve or is it the United States federal government that's actually doing this? Okay, and also it's going to lead to less secrecy about our money supply and how things actually go down, because the Federal Reserve is rarely talking about these things, whereas Obama is very open, and because there is information disclosure acts that everyone in the federal government is part of. Okay, so now let's get to the actual impacts here. We have 4 impacts that actually come off of this first advantage. The first one is that there's less free money for the United States federal government to use just for its arbitrary exploits. Basically, if the federal government wants to spend money for some project, be it a war in Afghanistan, a war in Iraq, they're actually going to have to be held more accountable if there is no Federal Reserve, because they're directly going to have to issue the statement to the mints to say, print more money. And when they do that, we're going to see that there's going to be a lot more political backlash, because people are going to know that, oh, this administration said print more money, they're what's actually causing this inflation. We're going to see a direct correlation, and the people are not going to vote people into office who are in favor of basically spending money that actually impacts the economy negatively. So this is going to lead to more political backlash. It's going to decrease the wars abroad that really don't get anywhere unless there is really a strong support of the people behind it. Okay, and now we can move on to the second point. That the second impact here is that the U.S. Mint and just having the U.S. FG do this alone is more efficient for what we actually need. So the Federal Reserve generally is more lagging than just actually printing the money, because it has to go through banks and things like that. So when there are issues that really do need the United States money, we don't have to go through that kind of old process, and we can actually get the things that need it more efficiently. We're going to be reducing bureaucracy, and that's good. The third point that we have is that there's going to be more open discourse. Because the Federal Reserve is not part of the federal government explicitly, it's not subject to all of the restrictions that most agencies in the federal government have. So they don't have any levels of accountability. They don't have anything that actually guarantees that they have to disclose the information about finances and things like that. And that's incredibly important, because the public needs the right information in a democracy. And basically, we can't have a working and functional democracy without that kind of information that everyone has the access to. How can you make an informed decision without that? And then finally, our fourth advantage, the fourth impact here, is that there's going to be less false blame to presidents, because most people look at economic woes as things that influence their decision, but they don't look at good economies as something that really influences how they vote. They see, okay, the economy is really, really bad, I'm going to vote the other guy into office. but it really doesn't matter that much when the economy is good. So the president gets a lot of bad blame when the Federal Reserve doesn't do a lot of good things, and this negatively influences his ability to work because he loses political capital and is unable to pass necessary reforms through other things, and he does not have the political clout that he could otherwise have. Okay, that's the first advantage with those 4 impacts. Now we're going to move on to our second advantage, that we're solving contradictory economic politics. So the first point is uniqueness, that the U.S. wants China to stop devaluing and controlling its currency. Basically, but the other point about uniqueness is that we're currently using the Federal Reserve to devalue our currency just by like loosening or tightening money. We're using our own socialistic type of policy here, and so we're having a contradictory system. So the link is that the plan clearly stops this. It says that we're going to have a supply and demand type of thing, where we can't increase the actual supply of money, but we can't change we actually have to increase the physical supply of money for doing that, and that follows along a kind of supply side, free market, international exchange, whereas the Federal Reserve, where you have this big backup that actually controls kind of in a socialistic manner, does not work the same way. The impact of this comes off leverage with China and actually getting China to stop devaluing its currency. China devaluing its currency is very bad because it means that the United States is not going to be able to compete with them internationally for like manufacturing and other things like that. So we're going to get much closer to solving the issue of China because, first of all, we're basically not going to be having this contradictory thing. They're not going to be able to use this as political leverage against us anymore. So what this is going to do is it's going to solve the trade deficit, and that means it's going to be more equal for when U.S. and China trade with each other. We're going to be sending more goods to them. They're going to be sending less to us. Trade deficit goes down. U.S. manufacturing goes up for the same reasons. We're going to be able to export more outward, and other people are going to buy less from China. This is good because it adds a more substantial component to the United States economy. When we have a more substantial component to the United States economy, that's good because it adds stability. We're not just passing money around, which is what so many of the economic activities of the United States are right now. We're actually producing something which adds a lot of stability to the economy. And we have that kind of stability. It means less risk of an economic collapse that could kill millions of people because their anarchy would break out. And for all these reasons, we affirm.
All right. So first off, I'd just like to extend a brief thanks to everybody. I'm going to be going over their case first and pretty much pointing out all of the massive holes that are in their case and pretty much the lack of specifics in their policy, which is going to ultimately lead to the fall of their entire policy because of the lack. They give you all these internal links, but they do not tell you many of the basic specifics that you need in a policy, such as how are we going to decide when to print money? They just say that the federal government is going to do it. They don't tell us if there's going to be a committee to do it, how within the current structure we're going to be able to do it, what happens to all the people who work for the Federal Reserve, and what happens to monetary policy as we know it in our modern economic times. So I'm going to be hitting all those points when I go over their advantages, so we'll go right to their first advantage and their 4 impacts. Their first advantage is that the U.S. is more self-accountable. I have a few responses to this before I even get into their impacts. First off, you're giving far too much power to the U.S. government, which is completely biased towards partisan politics, meaning that you have the Federal Reserve that currently is based with economists who study econ for a living. That's what they've done. They have their master's, PhDs in economics, and now you're giving it instead to members of the U.S. federal government who are pretty much subject to re-election, where people are appointed to work for the Federal Reserve in a bipartisan manner. So we can see that there is that clear difference first off that pretty much tilts it unequally towards pretty much the partisan politics that happen with the federal government. So that's why the U.S. is not going to become more self-accountable, because they're more self-accountable right now because the actual opinions and mechanisms used by the economists in the Federal Reserve are separate from public opinion, where the U.S. government is not. So the U.S. will not become more self-accountable. Instead, you'll just get policy that does not match with economic theory. So that being said, we can look to each and every single one of their impacts and find flaws in them. First, their first impact is that there's less free money. Here's the thing, the Fed is separate though, and they try to link this to less war, but they don't give you any substantial internal links to actually show you how just because there's less free money, it's going to lead to less war. In fact, I would turn this and argue that you have more free money, because if the federal government can decide at any given point that they just want to print more money, that's going to lead to 2 things. One, it leads to inflation, because they have no mechanism to withdraw money from the current pretty much money pot we have in the United States, because that's what the Federal Reserve does. So if they no longer have a way to withdraw money from the economy, all you're going to end up with is inflation in the long run. So it in no way links to less war. Actually, the impact of this should be the effect on the economy as a whole. There will in fact be more free money, because you no longer have these economists making it. And once again, they don't provide us with any framework to attack in their case because they don't tell us who's going to be making these decisions within the government itself. Their second impact is that it'll be more effective. However, it will not be more effective. It'll be more bureaucratic because any way that you cut it, instead of having this separate entity making economic decisions and having a board of advisors as well as all these researchers, now Congress or the Senate or whoever they're going to decide does this has to go through that process. These are the same people who are trying to write laws, who are trying to get reelected, who are constantly working on 3-4 committees at a time. So it's just going to add to the bureaucracy in the entire thing. And so you won't have a more efficient system. Third impact is that we'll have more open discourse. However, currently we have the best and the brightest economists in the world having open discourse with each other in the Federal Reserve. The reason that the United States people don't need to know every single second what the economists are talking about is because most of us wouldn't even get what they're talking about because it's so far above what senators and congressmen can even, what many of them would even have the capacity to do. So we can see that the fact that there's more open discourse is just going to lead to partisan gridlock. If we're all discussing it now, pretty much the real terminal impact of this is that we're going to gridlock because no one can agree on economic policy as is within the Senate. We can see everyone's arguing in the Senate and Congress what economic policy to take, so it's just going to perpetuate that gridlock when they actually have to make the decisions about how much money to print. Yes, one question.
Why shouldn't citizens have the right to know what's going on?
Citizens do have the right to know, and here's the thing, whenever the Federal Reserve makes a legitimate decision, like when they decide to do quantitative easing 1 and 2, it becomes public information. What we don't know is what they're talking about behind closed doors about how they're going to fix the economy, but we essentially in the end find out what the policy taken is, and people can react in that way. So it is not pretty much as bad as you say it is. Their fourth impact is that there's less false blamed precedents, but this has no net benefits in today's round. How can you weigh people saying that? How can you weigh people's opinions being more accurate as net beneficial? I don't see the link there. So that being said, their second advantage was that they solved for economic politics or something like that, and pretty much they tried to say, all right, first off, we're debasing our currency. Second off, we'll turn to this new free market alternative. And third, that'll lead to leverage with China. You can see the problems there innately within the contention itself. But they don't provide any direct link to show how we're going to gain leverage on China. In fact, you can turn the argument that debasing the currency is poor economic policy, because when you debase a currency, essentially you are making an active effort to increase exports and imports within a nation because it makes your goods cheaper relative to other countries' goods. So by debasing a currency, essentially you are encouraging trade. Now, what happened to pretty much combat quantitative easing 1 and 2 were the raise in oil prices, which is completely unrelated to the Federal Reserve. What the Federal Reserve did is exactly what pretty much they're saying we need to do, which is increase imports and exports, and we can see that's exactly what quantitative easing 1 and 2 did. That being said, we can get on to two disadvantages that we have in today's debate. The first is an economic disadvantage. Subpoint A is that we lose the ability to have monetary policy. We have no more ability to have quantitative easing, which is solely responsible for how quickly we pulled out of this recession. When you have quantitative easing, essentially you're boosting the aggregate demand in the economy, which is boosting consumer confidence and allows us to pull out of economic recession far quicker than we would have. The reason that we have the Federal Reserve is that after the Great Depression, we essentially needed a mechanism in order to put money in the economy to pull out of recessions. And so that's what we have the Federal Reserve for, and you lose that ability. The terminal impact of this is now you can get stuck in recession for months, years, and years with no ability to get out of it. All you can do is print money to try to fix it, and that leads to hyperinflation, which in the long run, if you don't have the Federal Reserve to peg interest rates, you can't have solvency for the inflation. So if you can no longer peg interest rates, you now have the free market competing on interest rates. So innately, they are going to increase interest rates, and in time of recession, that's just going to lead to further and further lag, and it's going to punch us deeper and deeper into recession. Now, subpoint B of that is that we lose the ability to make profit by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve takes 6% dividends from banks, so they made $82 billion last year alone during a time of recession, so we lose the opportunity cost of all that money. Meaning that when we're trying to write a budget and we're all complaining because we only cut $40 billion, now you can add $80 billion of cost to that, and we have further political turmoil because of that increase in cost, which means you have to cut social programs. Terminal impact of this is that the people need these programs that we now have to cut from in order to stabilize the economy. You have less strength in welfare, Medicaid, Social Security, meaning that the economy gets even worse. So for those disadvantages against the economic impacts of this policy, I urge the strongest vote in negation.
so first of all, I'd just like to begin by thanking our judges, our audience, my opponents, and my partner. Thank you all for being here today in the wonderful spirited debate. For a brief roadmap, I'm just going to be going over the plan, on case, and then off case. So first of all, at the top of the flow, we first talked about the plan and how we just wanted to have Congress pass this, that we're basically abolishing the Fed, so that the Fed won't exist, and only the federal government can actually have control over the economy of the United States. And I think that was something that has been kind of really thrown around and really argued in this round, but hasn't really been explained, is the idea that both the federal government and the Fed both have control over the economy. What I mean by that is the Federal Reserve has the ability to use monetary policy in order to control the economy, and then the federal government has the ability to use fiscal policy, whether that is expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy, in order to control the economy as well. And so our opposition has just been going over this idea that like automatically there's going to be hyperinflation, that the federal government isn't going to be able to control the economy the way that they want to if the Federal Reserve were to be demolished. But actually the federal government does have the opportunity to still control the economy, and our entire second advantage had to do with the idea that if the Federal Reserve were to be abolished, then there wouldn't be these two contradictory ideas and these two contradictory groups and bodies that have the ability to control the economy in two different ways. And so essentially we're trying to solve for that problem, and that's what second advantage was about. I'm going to get through my stuff and let you answer your question. So first of all, just on the plan, they talked about like how do we print the money, people who work for the Federal Reserve, all these things, and just asking all these like heinous questions. Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve doesn't print money in the first place, so that has nothing to do with this debate as a whole. Basically what the Federal does is they use tools of monetary and monetary policy in order to determine how to loosen or tighten money. And so these tools end up being the discount rate, the reserve requirement, all these things. They don't actually like print money in their mints and then give it to people. So the way that that works is like completely like contradictory. They only use their monetary policy in order to like affect the economy, but they don't print money. So how we print money is going to be the exact same as how we print money in the status quo. Okay, moving on. They talk about the idea of like who's making the decisions after that. Who's making the decisions about like the actual economic policy? Well, as I mentioned before, fiscal policy will still exist, and according to just the idea of economics, who controls fiscal policy? Well, that's the President of Congress, and the President of Congress, how they do fiscal policy is they can either up or lower government spending, and basically what that will do is that'll actually move aggregate demand, as they were talking about, to either the right or the left on a Keynesian or supply center economics curves. They would be moving aggregate demand by either upping or lowering government spending, and then what they would do is they could either up taxes or lower taxes, and that would ultimately have the same effect as loosening or tightening money. So the decisions are already being made, the decisions can be made, and ultimately the question is who is making this decision. All right, on our first advantage, we talked about how the U.S. would ultimately become more accountable for its spending, and they basically just talked about how we're giving too much power to the United States government. Well, first of all, the reason that the United States government deserves to have this power is because the people of the United States ultimately elect their government for a reason. They elect their president for a reason. They elect their representatives for a reason, because they elect these people because they want them to have the specific policies that they're going to use when they're in office. By allowing to have the Federal Reserve, we're ultimately giving this random body of people way too much power. So I'd like to turn that idea in that when you have the Federal Reserve, you're giving people who weren't elected by the people of the United States more power than they deserve. After all, we're part of a Republican democracy, and just this idea that people deserve to be represented by people who have the ideas they want to be represented by. And by allowing the Federal Reserve to have so much power, we're essentially allowing the Federal Reserve to affect the day-to-day lives of individual people and their discount rates, the reserve requirements, day-to-day lives of people. But the Federal Reserve, the people who run that, were not elected, and so essentially we're giving those people too much power. Additionally, they said the Fed is a separate from public opinion. But the thing is the public deserves to have the right to elect people who have an opinion that is similar to theirs, and elect people who ultimately will vote in a way that has like the monetary policy that they want. And so allowing the Fed to have this power essentially says that the Fed can do what they want that is different from what the actual public wants. And in the end, when we are having this representative government, the public deserves to have people represent them who actually have like similar policies to what they want. All right, so onto the impacts of that contention. We talked about how there's less money for the federal government to use, and they just said that the Fed is separate, and that there's ultimately more free money in the process that will cause inflation. Well, first of all, the federal government has the opportunity to ultimately like higher taxes and all of these things and like lower their government spending, which would ultimately counteract inflation. So they have the same ability to actually counteract like this whole idea of like inflation in the first place. On our second impact, we talked about how it's more efficient for what we actually need, and they just said that people are ultimately trying to get reelected. But if these people are trying to get reelected, then they're going to have monetary and economic policy that is synonymous and is congruous with the ideas of the people of the United States. And if those are what the people of the United States want, then ultimately they deserve to be elected and deserve to do that. The federal government would not have the ability to control fiscal policy if it wasn't a good idea. Like they wouldn't be able to control fiscal policy if the federal government didn't believe that it was fair that the people got to elect people who actually wanted to have representatives who actually had the same economic policy as they wanted. On our third impact, we talked about how there's more open discourse and they're not subject to restrictions. And they just said that there's open discourse in the Federal Reserve, but ultimately there isn't open discourse in the Federal Reserve. We don't know what's happening in the Federal Reserve. Ben Bernanke can make whatever decisions he wants. That doesn't necessarily affect who we elected or what we want. And then they talked about like partisan gridlock, but at the same time, like the Congress has to like choose the budget of the United States. You can't just say that like economics has to be completely separate from the federal government just because it can cause partisan gridlock. The reason there's partisan gridlock is because everybody's trying to fight to represent the people that they want to represent, and that's the reason why we have the federal government in the first place. On our second advantage, and our fourth was less involved with the president. They just said there's no link. Well, ultimately, like presidents can be blamed for like economic downturns when it wasn't necessarily their fault. On our second advantage, we just talked about how we're just solving contradictory economic policy, and they said that there's no link to like the leverage in China. But they failed to recognize like the actual links in the first place. In that, like the contradictory fiscal policy, like the Fed can like loosen money, while the federal government can like have contractionary like fiscal policy, which are like two contradictory things. And that was like the basic idea of this entire contention. Whereas they only like decided to try to destroy the links to our impacts. And so when that happens, and ultimately the United States can be on the same page, and when the United States can be on the same page, and they can have the objectives that they're trying to reach, whether it's like stopping inflation or having better employment, that can ultimately be reached faster, which can lead to our impacts. On their first DA, talked about how we're losing the ability to have monetary policy, but ultimately, I talked about this before, we can do the same things through fiscal policy, and that's extremely important. And then they decided to bring up the Great Depression, how after the Great Depression, the federal government, the Fed Reserve, ultimately tried to fix that. But if you look back to actually the stock market crash in 1929, after that, the Federal Reserve continued to try to have contractionary monetary policy, which basically means that they didn't loosen money in order to help the people. They still try to have contractionary fiscal policy, and that's why the federal government had to have all those plans and all those groups and all those people that were trying to help the people kind of get back on track. And so ultimately, the Fed didn't help them, and they like to turn that idea. And then they talked about how there's hyperinflation without the Fed, and there's ultimately going to be more inflation, but fiscal policy can solve for that, so that's not a problem. And then they talked about how we lose the ability to make money from the Fed. But ultimately, the United States government doesn't make money from the Fed. If you look at like the actual way that they do it, basically the federal government like borrows money from the United States government and uses like the discount rate and determines that and then lends it to the people. And then they try to turn our advantage here, where they advocate an eye for an eye, so that it's not legitimate. And ultimately, they talked about how we would have to cut social programs, but the United States federal government can determine how they want to do that. Those we should say, bro.
All right, everyone ready? Okay, so again, thanks everyone for being here, making today's day possible. Let's start at the very top of the affirmations framework. So they basically talk about, how it's not bad that they don't really have specifics, and they try to, again, explain their framework to saying that it's going to be decided upon by Congress, which is good because it represents the people. But remember that in her last speech, the last speaker comes up here and tells you that gridlock does very often occur, and she accepts that gridlock does occur because these representatives are supposed to be representing their people. And so she does say that if they do represent their people, that gridlock will occur. This is problematic because if the United States Congress has to decide whether or not to inject money into the economy or whether to take it out, then they have to act quickly in order to control that inflation, in order to control deflation. If we see gridlock occurring, and that gridlock that they very accept, we are going to see a lag in the economy. And we're going to see that the United States federal government is not going to be at all effective in controlling prices, which is going to mean that it's going to be difficult for us to come out of recession, and it's going to be in a huger crash when we get into these very high inflationary periods. So that's why it's a very bad idea for them, within their framework, to have the normal Congress decide whether or not we should be taxing or spending, because it's not a fast reaction to this monetary policy. Now, they also talk about how basically the Federal Reserve doesn't really matter because we can ultimately control inflation just by taxation and spending. But this is not true. The Federal Reserve plays an entirely huge point in this. They take money out of the economy when they do buy government bonds as well as securities, and they do the opposite when they sell them back. And this way, the Federal Reserve plays a huge point in controlling inflation. It can not only be done through taxes and spending, it must be done through this Federal Reserve and actually changing the money supply, physically changing the money supply. And in this way, this is why the Federal Reserve is crucial and why it cannot simply be replaced by taxation as well as spending. Again, I'd like to remind you that taxation and spending is simply not enough, and if you allow the affirmation to pass this resolution, you will simply allow them to react very slowly, and you allow our economy to entirely be crippled from these huge fluctuations of price that are not controlled by a gridlock Congress. Again, if you don't have monetary policy to peg interest rates and remove money from the economy, there is no way that you can control inflation or deflation created by this very fiscal policy. Oftentimes, the very fiscal policy that Congress passes in their huge amounts of spending bills or in their tax cuts actually do cause a change in inflation as well as deflation itself. So that is why we must have the Federal Reserve. We must have the Federal Reserve in order to correct for the changes made by the taxes as well as the spending bills within Congress. If you remove the Federal Reserve, you do not have that other check that actually is important in controlling the taxation as well as spending activities of Congress. Now down to their advantages. advantages. Okay, so they talk consistently about how, well, basically we need to represent the people, and the Federal Reserve has too much power because it's not represented by the people. A few responses to this. First of all, the Federal Reserve chairmen are appointed by the very people who were elected by U.S. representatives. So in this way, they are an extension of that representation. But moreover, we don't want monetary policy to be partisan. We don't want the people to be deciding on a certain monetary policy chair or a certain monetary policy simply because it goes along with their party lines. We want to look to what is smart economics. And the point at which you open up monetary policy completely towards what the media says and what the people want and what is partisan politics, you ignore economics and you do not allow the economy to be properly controlled, and you skew it towards an entirely political game, which is dangerous because it hurts our entire economy. They want monetary policy that goes completely along with politics, when in fact we need fiscal policy that looks towards protecting our economy. Now down to their advantages. So first of all, they talk about again and again and again how we can just control for this inflation by adjusting for taxes and by adjusting spending. Again, remember what I said at the very top under their framework. This is still not enough because the Federal Reserve is required to control the very government actions that they so call for, and we actually do need to physically change the money supply by buying as well as selling these government bonds and security. It's not enough to simply adjust taxes. You actually have to physically change the money supply, which they do not allow for in this plan. Again, extend over the entire point of inflation that is going to occur, Gary said in his speech, because there's absolutely no mechanism to remove from the economy. Inflation is bad because it hurts our economy, it leaves us completely stagnant, and it can lead to the entire collapse of economies as we saw with Germany. Now down to their second advantage. They talk about, again, the importance of the people's view and the importance of these people being represented within Congress. They completely reject the idea that it's going to be more bureaucratic and that Congress is going to have absolutely too much to do. Extend that across the flow. If you put this additional burden on Congress, that's one more committee they have to serve in, and that's one more burden, making and decreasing efficiency and all other aspects that Congress must actually achieve. Moreover, I already responded to the importance of people's viewpoints. You want to be looking to what is smart economic policy, not necessarily what is political in that instance. All right, now let's get down to their third advantage. They talk about opening up discourse, and they talk about how the people aren't consulted in that. Basically, well, gridlock is okay as long as we are representing the people. Again, if you accept gridlock, you accept that inflation and deflation are not going to be properly responded to in the economy. You accept huge fluctuations in the economy that the United States federal government is too slow to respond to. Again, even with the passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, we saw that Congress was very slow to respond. If you allow them to pass this policy, you rely on slow policies like that that aren't actually going to properly help the economy. Now they talk about basically the entirety of presidents. Again, no net benefits, scratch it off the flow. Now down to their second contention. They talk about how we will be on the same page with China, and that's ultimately going to increase trade between the two nations. I'd like to remind you that QE1 and QE2 does help trade, and that's what the Federal Reserve does right now. So there's no need to actually help this trade further because the Federal Reserve already does it through measured means. Moreover, they do not provide you the guarantee that this will actually lead to increased trade between China and the United States, whereas the Federal Reserve actions of QE1 and QE2 actually do guarantee that. So you have to look to the probability in that case. Now down to our disadvantages. So our first disadvantage was talking about the economic policy. Now you're going to be completely losing all of the controls on the economy. Again, they completely say over and over again that we can simply do this through taxing and spending. No, you cannot, because you don't have any physical mechanism to take that money back out of the economy. Now this inflation is really bad because ultimately prices continue to go up, people start saving their money, people stop spending it as much, and the value of the dollar incredibly worsens. And when we see rampant inflation occur, we can see entire collapses of the economy. When we see the entire collapse of the United States economy, we can see the entire collapse of the world economy. In fact, we see that many countries around the world actually peg their rates and their interest rates to the United States. So if we see this rampant inflation, if we see the collapse of the United States economy, we will see collapses around the entire world, a collapse of the global economy, which we will not even be able to get out of because the Fed is not able to control that and is not able to inject money back into the economy through selling securities. So remember that we are going to lead to bad economics for the entire world. Now they also don't really adequately respond to our second subpoint that we're going to be losing profits from the Federal Reserve. Remember, we're going to be losing over $82 billion in profits, which is incredibly going to lead to the cut of social programs. They don't say that social programs, they just basically don't respond to our entire point about social programs. The point is that things like Social Security, things like welfare, they're incredible economic stabilizers because they allow people to keep spending even when they don't have money, and it keeps the demand stable. If we're going to have to cut all those programs, we're going to lead to more fluctuations in our economy if you cut those economic stabilizers. Thank you.
Okay, now that my partner has essentially cleared up the entire flow, we can talk about actual comparative advantages and looking at the net benefits of both cases. So that's my first voter issue, is that the negative team wins on net benefits. If you look at our disadvantages, we can see that we have clearly won. There's not a lot of ink here on the disadvantages. We can see that they clearly have won these points. We've seen that we have maintained the economic collapse due to withdrawal of the Federal Reserve, and how it's actually going to take away our ability to have quantitative easings and actually peg interest rates. And this is one of the biggest points that you need to vote on in today's debate, is the fact that even though they may have fiscal policy, they don't have monetary policy to control that fiscal policy. You see, with interest rates, what the Federal Reserve can do is they can peg pretty much all the interest rates that banks don't have to pay a lot of money when they're borrowing from other banks, because every bank at any given time has to have a percentage of what they hold in their reserve. So if you want to pretty much loan out a lot of money, there's an interest rate bank to borrow from one another. If that interest rate's like 50%, banks aren't going to loan out past what they can. But if the interest rate's like 0.25, what it is now, they can loan out all they want, because there's no harm in it pretty much loaning out that money, because you can pay back the other bank for almost no cost. Now that you've lost that, essentially what happened is now you leave that to the free market. With a free market economy, you are going to see an increase in interest rates. If the free market had its way, banks would have these high interest rates, and they would just stockpile their money so that they could loan it to other banks who need that money at a very, very high cost. Now, when banks have high interest rates, that raises the interest rates in the entire world, and in specifically in the US economy, meaning that it hurts consumer confidence, meaning that we get stuck in recessions. That is the biggest point in today's debate, is that fiscal policy cannot get us out of recessions without monetary policy to control the inflation, or to actually be the actor in getting us out of that recession. That being said, we can see that the net benefits fall towards the negative team, because if you stick with the status quo, you stick with a well-balanced system in which economists are making the decisions, and the US hears about these decisions, and the federal government continues to just worry about fiscal policy. We can pretty much perm a lot of their advantages in their case, because what they're doing is pretty much saying, here are all the reasons why fiscal policy is good. With the negative case, we still have fiscal policy, so you can absorb all of those benefits from their case, but still maintain the advantages, which is why we win this case, because they do not show you any unique harms to the Federal Reserve, which is my voter issue number 2. Their advantages hurt the economy, and they haven't given us framework necessary to win this round. The only harm that they said in the status quo is that there's currently contradictory economic policy. There's always been contradictory economic policy, and they even agree that in Congress itself, there's this contradictory economic policy, which will only lead to gridlock, something that they agree to. So we see this is only exacerbated when the federal government is the only one that can pretty much respond to what's happening in the economy. You can see it'll take months and months and months to respond, where the Federal Reserve, because they're separate from the actual government, can respond much more quickly and get us out of recessions. So that being said, that's the really only harm in the status quo to the Federal Reserve, is that there's this contradictory policy where the fiscal policy is doing one thing and the monetary policy is doing another. Many times when they're doing different things, one is trying to control the other. Mostly it's the Federal Reserve trying to control the spending done with fiscal policy so that inflation doesn't get out of control. With their plan, they're opening the gates to rampant inflation or deflation, which is equally as bad. So we can see that in the end, when you actually weigh the cases, the negative team and the status quo win hands down, because you maintain all the advantages to having this fiscal policy, but you still have that control in the economy due to monetary policy. Moreover, they don't hit our disadvantage about the $82 billion that would have been lost just last year during economic recession. That's hundreds of billions of dollars that the U.S. government is no longer taking in, which hurts our social programs, which furthers our inability to get out of economic recession. So I urge you to vote on the economic side of this debate and see that clearly we need the Federal Reserve. They sell securities and bonds as well as buy those up. That's the only way that we can change the amount of currency that's actually in the economy. And they don't tell you that there's going to be any new congressional committees that are going to have the power to remove money from the economy. So since we no longer have that tool, the only thing we can do is add money to the economy, and you can just go to you can then extend all of the disadvantages that we've repeated 12 times about why that's bad and why that hurts the economy. So in the end, looking at their advantages, they say the U.S. is more self-accountable. We have obviously proven that this is not true. Extend all my partners' reputation to their 4 impacts of this, especially their 4th impact, which is just dropped because it doesn't actually have any net beneficial value. And the second one, that there's this economic confliction in politics, which is going to lead to us opening trade with China. Well, guess what? Monetary policy, aka debasing the value of your currency, just does just that. So for all these reasons, because it makes the most economic sense and the most social sense with our social programs, I urge a vote for the status quo and maintaining and keeping the Federal Reserve. Thank you.
Can I get the order first?
What's that?
Can I get the order first?
Yeah, the order is I'm going to be going over the things that just came up in the last few speeches, and then going over to voters, and just, extended arguments. All right. Let's look at what just came up in the last speech about how we're going to have monetary policy under either case, but they have fiscal policy as well. They talked about a lot of new arguments in the last speech about how banks have to have a certain amount of actual physical money. This is a new point that's in the last speech, so I'm going to respond to it right now. The Federal Reserve is actively trying to get rid of this. We looked this up in the prep time, and right on the Federal Reserve's homepage, they are trying to get rid of this qualification that the banks actually have to have a certain amount of money in the actual bank itself. So this is going to be very important because we're continuously decreasing this amount of actual physical money that must exist in the current system. This is incredibly important because it means that there's going to be a lot more hyperinflation. A hyperinflation is printing or creating money that shouldn't actually exist. And so that's very important because we've kind of agreed that inflation is a very, very bad thing in this scenario. And when you have two entities that can help create inflation, then clearly you're seeing that that's a very bad thing. We're having not just one level of inflation that has accountability directly from the people, but you have one entity that says, oh, whatever economic policy there is, even if it says inflation is good, then you can do whatever you want, basically. There's no accountability from the people, yes.
Do the best and brightest economists in the world make economic decisions on a whim?
See, but that's the thing. You're saying that economists are pretty much the best thing ever, but you see that there's a huge division between economists. There's a Keynesian side, there's a neoclassical side. Which one is right? These are so divided that no one exactly knows what is right. What would be the better gauge? Would it be to say that just the people should decide, or just these economists who may have different views should decide? And moreover, you're ignoring the fact that it's not just about what the money is or how much money is out there, but what it's spent for and how the accountability actually exists. If the Federal Reserve is printing the money that has a poor economic impact on the United States because it increases inflation, then the people should hold the Federal Reserve accountable, but they don't because they don't see that because they don't have that level of accountability. They don't have that office. They're not required to because they're not part of the federal government. It's a very apparent fact. Yes?
Considering the Federal Reserve is the one that controlled the inflation and kept it low for QE1 and QE2, how does this argument stand?
See, what we're having is quantitative easing was an increase of inflation. That's what you're saying. You're having very contradictory points if you're talking about, your response to our second advantage was actually quantitative easing, would increase the inflation because it would decrease the value of the American dollar. You're having two different things here. You're very contradictory in your points, and it doesn't work overall. No, I can't take any more points at this time. So now, furthermore, they try to perm all of our advantages in here. They realistically cannot perm all of these advantages because really there's nothing that they actually get out of this. They try to say that there's going to be the same amount of free money for arbitrary or bad exploits. But look, we have more levels of oversight because the people are actually going to be able to respond. This means that we can extend the actual terminal impact from our first speech. We're not going to be fighting all these stupid wars in Iraq. We're not going to be fighting the stupid wars in Afghanistan if the people don't want us to go there. That's an important thing because it links to lives lost and otherwise. Things like that, and that's very important. You can talk about how all of these things, like open discourse, they say that the Federal Reserve is going to have more levels of open discourse because, we know about it after the fact. Okay, well, we know about the Holocaust after the fact, but that doesn't change the fact that we would have stopped it if we could have. They have no responses to the real things, and they're just trying to get around it by just skirting these issues and just talking their way prettily around it. And furthermore, the rate of efficiency, like how fast the government is actually able to get through these things, he admits that the government is faster. They've contradicted themselves here. 3 minutes and 22 seconds into their speech, he says that the government is faster in actually printing the money because he says that the government is capable of doing it faster. No, you cannot point of order because you said it in your speech. I'm just taking what you said.
Fed.
Okay.
The Fed is the Federal Reserve, not the government.
Okay, but they don't have the power to print money, and that's important.
I just want to clarify that for the judges.
Okay.
He said point under consideration.
Okay, thank you.
So basically, he said the power to print money. He's talking about the government. Clearly, I heard this in 3 minutes and 22 seconds in his speech. I wrote it down. It was very important because it contradicts entirely what they said on their side. And so, more importantly, we have the actual impacts that talk about. They talk about gridlock, and we have two responses to this. That lagging, the Federal Reserve is one lagging, so it's not as responsive to begin with. So that takes it out as a uniqueness level. But more importantly, the gridlock is capable of stopping bad things more than it's capable of stopping good things. And this links back to our first advantage, which should be the biggest advantage in the round. It has the highest probability of actually stopping wasteful spending, and that's important because it stops wars, it stops bad things like that. And the wars clearly have a higher impact than what they're talking about, even if you buy their idea that the economy is going to collapse because of inflation, which has a very, very low probability, especially when you factor in our second advantage about the stability of the economy because we're going to have more actual, like, creating manufacturing jobs. And moreover, they haven't actually shown you one important thing, which is why the federal government would, in and of itself, cause inflation. Now, this is incredibly important because all of their disadvantages about, the end of the world scenarios here come from the idea that the Federal Reserve is going to somehow make more, just print money like crazy. But they have not adequately warranted this claim. They have not shown it, but in the status quo, we see that the Federal Reserve is doing just that. It is reducing interest rates to the lowest they have ever been, and basically, they are doing much more than the federal government ever would. They have not proven this claim, and therefore they cannot link to any of their impacts, and for that reason, you must affirm.